Welcome to another great event here at the Brazil Center. As many of you know, this is election season throughout the world, including here, but the Brazilian election season has just ended, much to the relief of our speaker today, André Pagliarini. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Those of you who follow the writings of the Washington, Brazil office will know exactly who he is. He's one of the major writers of this, but he's in other elements of his life. He's not only a top journalist, but also an assistant professor of history and international studies at Louisiana State. And he's also a non-resident expert at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I know that we all kind of yearn in our hearts for responsible statecraft, and but at least Andre has some relationship to that in a more physical way than the rest of us who are just praying for it. He's widely published both in academic journals like the Latin American Research Review, Latin American Perspectives, and the Latin Americanist, but also he's very well known as a journalist on Latin American topics and has published in places like the New Republic, The Guardian, which I'm sure many of you are reading these days because it's one of the few places that regularly publishes news on Brazil, The Jacobin, for those of you of revolutionary perspectives, and the New York Times, among other things. He's finishing two books to being a little bit overproductive and over prolific. Some of us might think. One on the intertwined histories of Lula da Silva and the 20th century of Brazil. He has a very important role in that. And of course, our Brian Pitts has also written a lot about the Lula period. You sort of can't get around it because of its implications. And it's sort of, how shall we say, the counter-revolution. And then the other thing he's writing is on the politics of nationalism in modern Brazil. So he's got a lot to say, and he follows the politics very closely. Again, this is why you should be reading the Washington Brazil office weekly dispatches, because they're so important. We wanted to talk to Andre about a couple of things. One is that there's just been these elections of over 5,000 municipal and mayoral and council elections in Brazil. So in the same way that we all follow presidential elections, but we also know that municipal or smaller down polling or down ballot, I believe is what we call this, down ballot candidates can be extremely important. I wanted to start off a little bit because what his sense is of how these municipal elections are transforming and reflect the dynamics that's going on between the Bolsonarista right wing or other national right wing, and then the sort of more progressive left wing that is incarnated in Lula and to some degree in the Workers' Party. So if we can just start, I'd like a sort of general overview about how things sort of shaped up. And then, particularly for my interest, I'm curious about what's going on in Amazonia, because this is so important in terms of the fact that there's now a major biodiversity conference going on in Cali, which has a lot of influence and discussion about Amazonian development and its politics. And also we have the BRICS meeting, which has a lot of questions about what's going on in third world development and the creation of what we might call a different ideological framing of development. And then, of course, we'll have the COP meeting in Brazil next fall, the climate meeting. So Amazonia is kind of swirling around in a lot of these questions, and Brazil is very central to that. So, Andre, why don't you start by giving us sort of an overview of what you thought, what you think about the current dynamics of these elections?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just begin by saying thank you for the invitation. I've known Dr. Brian now for maybe 10 years. We're interested in a lot of the same questions and the same, historical period in Brazil. So I was very grateful that he, reached out and asked me to have this conversation with you. It's a really interesting moment. Interesting, maybe I should say, or maybe concerning, terrifying for global democracy in a lot of ways. So I prepared a very sort of loose set of remarks, attending to the points you raised, Zena, and then maybe we'll just kind of open it up. For some context, it's worth noting that Brazil right now is being governed by Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is in his third term after governing 20 years ago for 2 terms in Brazil. And it's really important to note that Lula is a man of the left. He comes out of a working class party built through the coalition of various different social movements. But because of the very particular set of services in Brazil over the past years or so, is governing I would call it a centrist coalition as president. Brazil has several parties. And in order to govern at the national level, one must cobble together through all kinds of different means a political platform that can appeal to these various different parties of different ideological hues, some with almost no ideology, interested more so in the pursuit of power for the sake of power, some with more conservative tendencies, and some, like Lula's Workers' Party, with a left or sort of center-left orientation. So the municipal elections that just happened in Brazil occur against the backdrop of Lula's attempts to hold together this diverse coalition. And holding together that coalition is so important given that Brazil faces what is probably the most concerted far-right challenge that it has faced since the return of democracy in the late 1980s. Brazil's democracy today is just about as old as I am. It comes into being in the late 1980s. And so represented by former President Jair Bolsonaro is this deep questioning of whether democracy in Brazil, as currently constituted, is worth preserving in its current form, or whether it needs to be seriously refashioned in some way. I think Bolsonaro would say along his preferred lines. So the stakes of this municipal election are quite high. Municipal elections in Brazil, I think it's fair to say, assume a greater degree of importance than in the U.S. political system, the U.S. political context. The município, that is the municipality in Brazil, is a very important sort of unit of governing. It's not to say that it predicts what will happen in any sort of direct way in the next 2 years of Lula's 4-year term, right? Lula will be up for re-election in 2026. But it does tell us a great deal about where things stand, basically which political forces are up, which are down, how the president and the federal government might modulate or seek to shift their focus in these next 2 years. And there's a lot of information that they're chewing over right now, just after the second round of voting this past Sunday. So where do things stand? So Lula's Workers' Party, maybe it's worth starting there. The good news for them from the president's point of view, and I would argue for anyone interested in sort of progressive politics more broadly, the good news is that it grew. The party, and I wrote down the numbers here, in 2020, 4 years ago, elected 182 mayors. This year, they elected 252. So that's growth. The high point came in 2012 when the PT, the Workers' Party, governed 637 cities. In 2016, they elected 254, down to 182 in 2020, and this year up to 252. So a sharp decline and a somewhat of a rise Now, it's a matter of perspective. From the point of view of many observers, that growth was really almost ridiculous, given that the party controls the federal government, that one would expect a much sharper growth. Some of the PT say, well, we grew, and so we're digging out of a very deep hole. Because the question, of course, more broadly with this municipal election is, would Brazilian voters in voting in municipal elections punish in some way the Lula government for whatever reason? I can talk about the state of the economy and public safety and all these other questions. And in so doing, would it seek to elevate far-right candidates supported by the former president? Now, the big takeaway I would underscore from the municipal elections is that certainly from the PT's point of view, this was not a resounding win by any measure. They grew, but nowhere near what one might have expected. For example, in Araraquara, a city in the interior of the state of São Paulo, the outgoing PT mayor, largely considered to be within the party the future head of the Workers' Party, Edinho Silva, who was seen as a rising star within the party, failed to elect his chosen successor. The PT did not win that city. So this was a serious hit to his own political standing. I can talk about internal rifts now within the PT that are beginning to emerge. So not fantastic for the PT by any stretch of the imagination. However, the alternative also didn't come to pass. That is, this was not a resounding victory in any way for former President Bolsonaro. In almost every second round election, the Bolsonarista candidate lost. Whereas in 2020, several former cabinet members of Bolsonaro, in many cases, different flavors of extremists, many of them were elected to the Senate, to governor's offices, and other positions. This year, none did. None of the former Bolsonarista cabinet members seeking higher office won. So this was not a banner year either for the left or center left, but it also wasn't for the far right either. And so the narrative that I think is already sort of taking shape among political commentators is that the municipal election empowered centrist forces, by which I mean those forces that either aesthetically or in terms of its tone and rhetoric is seeking to neither align itself with Lula or Bolsonaro. The most powerful person, arguably, to come out of this municipal election is Gilberto Kassab, who is a political sort of emerging sort of kingmaker, as it were, who heads the PSD, the Party of Social Democracy, who, intriguingly, is aligned at the state level with the governor of São Paulo, who is a former minister of Bolsonaro, who is trying to present himself as a more moderate conservative voice. And yet at the national level, Kassab is quite close with Lula. His party holds positions in the cabinet. And so if we zoom out, the outcome of the municipal elections is not entirely positive for the left or the far right, but it does indicate, I think, that the next 2 years of Lula's administration, the final 2 years of this third term, will be primarily about who can pull that center towards their corner. This is very different, I think, I would argue, than what Brazil has been experiencing since probably 2016. The presidential election of 2018, following the ouster of former President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, in a really heated climate of sort of very thin accusations. What comes out of that is a political moment in which basically the further right one could position themselves, the more anti-PT and anti-Lula, anti-Workers' Party one could be, that would pay enormous political dividends. And it seems that this municipal election this year suggests that that might be weakening that process of radicalization on the right yielding political dividends. Not completely. In the state of São Paulo, for example, one of the most elected new city council members is a very young, really far right, really online young man. So it's not it's not that that's been extinguished, but in the cities that really matter, major cities, we see, I think, at least a limit to the appeal of the kind of far right energy that has really dominated Brazilian politics in recent years. So again, the contest will be to see whether Lula can sustain that center-minded political coalition that I mentioned at the beginning here, where he's governing as a man of the left, but a coalition in which the left is a partner to other centrist forces, or whether he will lose that center component of his coalition to forces on the right. That's the dispute that I think we'll be watching in the next 2 years, is who is able to appeal to those center forces. I think today odds still are with Lula, in part because he has demonstrated an ability to do that. Those organized around Bolsonaro, the former president, and those really close to him, they have not demonstrated that ability to go out and appeal to center forces, right? What we saw in recent years were center forces glomming onto them because that's where the electoral energy was, but we have not seen the inverse of them, the far right, successfully courting centrist forces when they needed to for political reasons. So that's something I'll be really interested to watch going forward. And it's interesting to note too, the landscape of the municipal elections. We were talking before the event began about Belém, which is a city I was kind of watching, and many were watching, because it's going to host COP next year, which is the International Climate Conference. And the Bolsonarista candidate in that race had suggested perhaps that the city would back out of hosting, in part because for the Brazilian far right, notions of climate change, an international collective effort to stem the advance of climate change, reeks of globalist interference, ideological, corruption, all these things. But that's not. But he lost, right? So the candidate who won in Pará is a member of the very kind of centrist party, the MDB, and he has assured that will go forward. So even though the PT and the Workers' Party did not have a fantastic year, I do think there was a sigh of relief within members of the administration that it wasn't a great success for the radical right either. In part because, and here I'll segue a little bit to talking about international affairs, and then I'm happy to sort of take questions or to keep going. But why does all this matter? I think the municipal question and the domestic political standing of the Lula government matters because Lula has made no secret of his desire to influence the hemisphere's politics, geopolitics more broadly. And there is a direct correlation in Brazilian politics, I would argue, well, many countries, but in Brazil too, between a president's domestic standing and international standing, and vice versa. There's a way in which I think Bolsonaro's crumbling international standing, by the end of his term, he was essentially a pariah. Nobody wanted to be seen with him. No foreign leader except Vladimir Putin really wanted to be seen with Jair Bolsonaro. And I think this really hurt him at home, especially in the context of a close presidential election. That hurt Bolsonaro. Lula's case is also similar, I would argue, that his ability to inject Brazil into major debates about the pressing global issues right now, Ukraine, Israel, Venezuela, that has some impact on his standing at home. Lula remains broadly popular, approval ratings above 50%, but it has taken a toll on his approval rating when, for example, he has made comments about Israel that were broadly panned by many international observers. In other words, the perception that the Brazilian president is out of step with global opinion, I think, does have some domestic impact, and vice versa. So we'll have to sort of see what the global impact of these domestic elections on Lula standing abroad might be. But as I was saying earlier, it's not as if the bottom fell out and Lula has been completely discredited at home. Some in the media are suggesting that's not how I would interpret what happened in this municipal election. The PT, held its own, grew a little bit, but it's not, back on the path to international, sort of domestic political bliss. So in the last 2 years of this administration, Lula, I think, clearly still wants to be a player when it comes to climate change, which I can talk more about, the BRICS bloc, in which Brazil is a very active member. And I think it would have been harder for him to do that had this been a truly disastrous year for the PT. The way it is now, I think it essentially confirms more or less a status quo orientation of this administration. So what does that look like? When it comes to BRICS, which just had its meeting in Russia, its annual summit, I think Brazil remains deeply committed to BRICS. It wants it to succeed and be a powerful force in the world, but it's at an important sort of decisive moment in which BRICS is experiencing a pretty rapid growth. Right, what began as this kind of loose agglomeration of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa at the start of the 21st century, really, is now growing to include countries like Iran, Egypt, and several others, Ethiopia, I believe, many others. It was reported that, and it's more or less been confirmed, that Brazil actually, under the Lula administration, opposed the rapid expansion of BRICS. And there are sort of intuitive reasons why that might be. Brazil, it's not a nuclear power like Russia, it's not, China, but being part of this relatively select club of major countries enabled Brazil, which is, of course, the largest country in Latin America, one of the most important producers of foodstuffs in the world and all kinds of advanced industrial output. It's a major country. It allowed it to sort of rub elbows with these really other, global powers, Russia, India, China. Expanding BRICS, almost by definition, dilutes Brazil's influence within that body. So Brazil had resisted this, and yet there was a great Reuters story about this earlier this year about this exact question. Members of Brazil's foreign service recognized off the record that they did not have the power to prevent expansion. So what we're seeing now, however, is an attempt by the Lula government to attempt to dictate the terms of expansion. And we saw that most recently with the Brazilian veto of Venezuela and Nicaragua joining BRICS. Both of those countries wanted to. They did not, interestingly, veto Cuba's entrance into the BRICS. This is what I mean when I was saying earlier about, Lula standing at home, I think having some ability on his, or some bearing on his ability to project strength and influence abroad. The fact that Lula is broadly popular at home, I think, empowers him, at least, the very least, in his own sort of conception of his standing, to take these swings abroad. But interestingly, on the question of Venezuela, we have seen a major shift in Brazilian policy in recent months. Lula, who for years now had been a stalwart defender of Chavismo, of Hugo Chavez, and then his successor, Nicolas Maduro, has begun subtly but very clearly to distance himself from that regime. And so I think what we might be seeing in these last 2 years of the Lula government is an attempt to reassert Lula's position as a figure in the mainstream, as the kind of galvanizing figure of the political mainstream at home and abroad. So in terms of domestic politics, what does that mean? It means being able to speak convincingly and attracting forces of differing ideological hues. Centrists, maybe even some center-right, and then the left and the center-left, around a platform of democracy, institutions, so on and so forth. Abroad, what that means is remaining committed to multilateral institutions. There is almost no greater partisan of the UN anywhere in the world than Lula, right? Lula has spoken extensively about the need to reform the UN in order to preserve its relevance. And I can say more about that in a little bit also. And so that's the challenge when it comes to BRICS, though, that I think Brazil faces right now. We're at a very interesting inflection moment where I've begun to sort of just thinking about these ideas that I'll probably put into writing at some point, which is that one way I've understood the Brazilian government's veto of Venezuela and Nicaragua is as a way of recentering Brazil's geopolitical role. By which I mean, Brazil remains very committed to the BRICS, but BRICS is not a strictly democratic bloc in any real way, right? Russia, of course, it's hardly a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. China is not really a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. India under Modi is not a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. So Lula is in this delicate position of remaining committed to BRICS, but wanting to be a kind of democratic conscience of BRICS. This is my reading in any case. And so that's how it's in that context that I understand the recent moves about Venezuela and Nicaragua. I think it got to a point in Venezuela where the Maduro regime is not even pretending anymore to go through the motions of democratic processes in ways that Brazil, which gave them a lot of rope, could recognize. Again, I want to stress, I think the part of the logic here that Lula is embracing has to do with domestic politics and international politics, that Brazil is not choosing sides in the international realm between, say, the United States and European Union on the one side, and then BRICS on the other. Rather, Lula wants a very strong presence in the UN. He has long called for a reformulation of the UN Security Council to include Brazil, for example. He wants to remain in BRICS while being its sort of democratic conscience, in that way, planting the flag for Brazil as a member of the West. In fact, Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira said this week or last week at the BRICS conference that he said, quote, "As far as I know, Brazil is part of the West." And so it's trying to modulate these different constituencies and place Brazil at the mainstream of international opinion, such that the United States can talk comfortably with Brazil, Russia can talk comfortably with Brazil. That's the goal abroad, and I think it reflects the domestic priority too, which is to place which is to place Lula and his government as a kind of common sense in between in an era of really effervescent energy on the far right. Lula as a kind of bulwark, Lula's Brazil, his vision of democracy as a bulwark against this rising tide of reaction at home and increasingly abroad as well. So that's how I think the municipal elections fit into the last 2 years of Lula's term. It wasn't, as I keep saying, it wasn't a fantastic year for the PT, but it also was just enough, I would argue, to suggest that the government is delivering for enough people to remain credible and viable as a governing anchor of the Brazilian political system. That, I think, is the strategic goal of the Lula government in this really delicate moment. There's a lot, that's going to happen in these next 2 years. The ball's going to roll a lot, as you might say in Brazil. Bola vai rolar muito. But I still think, most observers would say that Lula remains in a very strong political position to win re-election. Maybe the most important political analyst, Gilberto Kassab, who I mentioned as the head of the PSD, one of the most important political kingmakers, he said he would not bet against Lula in a presidential race today in 2026. And so that's the context that I want to just conclude this part of my remarks on. It wasn't a great year for Lula's party, but the medium-term outlook is nowhere near as gloomy as some in the party are worried about in this moment. So I think maybe I'll stop there for a minute, and then if there are any questions, I'm happy to keep going. But I'll take a break there.
Bunch of questions. And thank you so much for this excellent overview. I have it. I'll start with the sort of municipal set of questions, which is how did this break down geographically? Because obviously there are very different dynamics in Brazil, depending if you're in the south and southwest, and where you have more industrial and very powerful agro-industrial development as well. It has it looks different. The income is different. The Northeast, which has a different historical politics. And of course, Amazonia, which is highly contested and for economic reasons is not particularly enamored with the environmental agenda of Lula. So could you comment on that? And then I'd like to ask you another question, which has to do with the issue of the BRICS are not particularly democratic. So it's one of these questions about it's important that you have a democratic, a person who's committed to democracy within it. But in general, it's sort of constructing itself as a group of authoritarians as not even a counterweight within a different sort of set of, I guess we got the term of art these days is multipolarity, although it seems to be not multipolar. But anyway,
Right.
let's start with the Brazilian geography, electoral geography, and then move on to this other really important question in which Brazil has actually a really critical role. And if the right wing comes in, it's more aligned with where BRICS
Right.
is than when it began.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question of geographic sort of dispersion. In Brazil's recent history, the PT was really, as one of the largest political parties, one of the ones that was hemorrhaging the most electoral support really across the country. And so what we've seen in this race, I would argue, is a similar kind of common narrative thread in the results, as it were, of this kind of sort of centrist, center-right tone of politics prevailing almost in every part of the country. So let me, for example, in the city of São Paulo, the second round was between Ricardo Nunes, who is a center-right, or a person who is on the right, but presenting himself as a center-right with the support of Bolsonaro, but the kind of lukewarm support of Bolsonaro, against a member of the left in Guilherme Boulos, who is has a history of activism on the left and was seen as a kind of extremist on the left, even though he tried to present himself as a centrist. Also, in that case, where there was a clear candidate of the left, Guilherme Boulos lost handily. In other disputes, for example, I mentioned Belém in Manaus, the capital of Amazonas, in Belo Horizonte, these major marquee races of the second round, in almost all of them, in Salvador, almost all of them, the hardline right-winger lost. Evandro Leitão of the PT won in Fortaleza, one of the few major cities that the PT won this cycle. And so that is if we look at the map of which parties are winning where, various different parties, but the ideological sort of current, I would argue, is this kind of centrist current, sometimes with the support of the PT, sometimes with the support of the right. But that's where the real victory really was in region after region. For example, another important race in the south, in Porto Alegre, where that was decided in actually in the second round. The incumbent who presided over a really disastrous response to flooding and all of this was reelected because his opponent, Maria do Rosário of the PT, was defined politically, or is defined politically, as a leftist, as maybe many felt a radical leftist. So that, in almost every region of the country, hurt the candidate who was seen to be clearly identified with one ideological pole of the other. Now, it's worth noting, of course, that many of these centrists are also ideological in their own ways, right? The Centrão, the parties of the political center in Brazil, it's almost a misnomer to call them centrist, because many of them are center-right, if not right-wing in their orientation. But what makes them center forces is as parties, their pursuit of power almost independently of who's in government at the time. So, for example, if the PT is in power at any given moment, they might find a way of negotiating and maintaining a dialogue with them. If Jair Bolsonaro is in power, they'll find a way of negotiating and working with them. So, centrist by which I mean sort of at the center of the Brazilian political system,
Central.
not in that they reflect a centrist kind of politics. That, I think, is the major story, region after region in Brazil, of this election, is a repudiation of ideology on left and right. Another race that was important the second round, Goiás, where the right-wing governor, of Goiânia, no, the right-wing governor of the capital, broke with Bolsonaro in the state of Goiás, but is very much a right-wing governor, but not a Bolsonarista anymore. And so that dispute came down between a far-right person and a right-wing person. The far-right person lost. So that's really the story in region after region. I was going to say something else, but that's really the story here. And it's worth noting for those watching who followed Brazilian politics, going back to the 1990s, the party that most lost mayors and towns and cities of government was the PSDB, the party of former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the party that was in the second round against the PT in every presidential race, or not every, but several presidential races in a row in the 1990s, holding down this anchor of center right and center left, is basically now being sort of washed out almost everywhere in the country. Now, to the question
There's always Amazonia. You have left out Amazonia,
Well, so Manaus is another case in this municipal election where the more sort of center-minded candidate prevailed. He was reelected of the MDB, the party of former President Michel Temer. Again, I think reflecting a little bit a sense of, and I know this anecdotally, by the way, a lot of, almost my entire family voted for Bolsonaro. There's a sense among many voters that the constant anger and invective of the Bolsonaro years, a lot of people are just tired of it. And I think that has to do with many of the issues as well, and the way political races are being run. Again, on the left and the right, Boulos in São Paulo was hurt by his very much left-wing associations. And I think the same is true in Amazonas, where in Manaus, where the sense that when it comes to the environment, when it comes to Brazil's environmental policy, that it had been polarized under Bolsonaro. And I think there's an attempt by some of these forces in the center to try to depolarize. This is in part, it should be said, because the Lula government itself is torn by competing priorities when it comes to environmental matters, right? The senator from the state of Acre, Randolfo Rodrigues, who was very close to Lula, in fact, was a leader of the Lula's coalition in the Senate, is very much in favor of efforts that Petrobras has put on the table, the national oil company, to drill basically at the heart of the Amazon River. Petrobras insists it can be done cleanly and safely. On the other side of the dispute is Environmental Minister Marina Silva and members of IBAMA and other parts of the federal government that deal with environmental conservation to say, even if it could be done safely, it's not worth it. It's not worth the risk to explore the Amazon as is being done just to the north of Brazil, in the Essequibo region, that Venezuela contests, where there's enormous oil reserves that are being found and extracted. So part of what Lula, I mentioned this idea of balance, right? Lula is trying to balance his coalition. The same is true on environmental matters. And I think the fact that the Lula government is driven by these competing priorities perhaps gives some permission at the lower level of politics for these debates to depolarize somewhat, as they had been under Bolsonaro. At the municipal level, we see that absolutely. You raised an interesting question, which is whether or not Brazil can succeed as that democratic conscience I mentioned within the BRICS. It's not a given that it can. I mean, if BRICS as it expands, opts to go down this path of basically an anti-US coalition, I do think Brazil would have a problem with that, because that would reflect choosing a side. And I think Brazil's whole deal under Lula is that we want to be able to trade and negotiate and talk openly with everyone. And so, I think that sort of is the major foreign policy challenge when it comes to BRICS in these next 2 years, is whether Brazil can bring to bear its influence to help influence the direction BRICS takes. I think it's clear that countries like Russia and China are interested in a completely alternative set of institutions. For example, the BRICS does a major bank that is financing projects all over the world, headed by former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, with the stated aim of moving the world away from the hegemony of the US dollar. So that's all clear. The question, of course, again, from a geopolitical point of view, will be to what extent that boxes Brazil in diplomatically. Brazil would say there's nothing inherently un-American about the global South and other countries moving away from the dollar. That empowers, parts of the world that might feel powerless in the US-led post-war world order. But from the US point of view, of course, I think with some legitimacy also, that kind of realignment under the auspices of US adversaries is alarming from a US point of view. This is where, again, Lula's diplomatic tact and all this will be tested. But again, that's what I see happening with the Venezuela and Nicaragua veto. I think Lula wants to underscore, perhaps this time for a Western audience, that Brazil is a democracy. It remains committed to human rights and freedom of expression and all that, even as it remains an active member of BRICS, which, as you note, is dominated in large part by countries that are not democracies. That's the tightrope
The
Lula is walking.
expanded BRICS in particular, with the petro states, get so confusing sometimes. But with the petro structure in there, it's much less democratic. The other question I would raise too is that it has often been said that Brazil has moved away from American hegemony in the hemisphere into the question of Chinese dominance because of its dominance of trade and investment. So in that light, I'm sort of trying to think about these geopolitical questions, because of course we were thinking about the pink tide at an earlier phase in Lula, and this sort of more, well, maybe centrão, but more libertarian, less state intervention in the practices of investment and development might be reflecting a sort of different, more right ideology, which also has may be reflecting the investment and ideological dynamics of the Chinese. I don't want to use the term hegemony too loosely, but too rigidly, but it is the main trading and investment partners. Curious what you have to say about that.
I think this is one of the reasons why politically at home in the municipal elections, as I was just saying, why the bottom didn't fall out for the PT. And the reason for that is economically, things are doing quite well. Brazil, they're breaking records in the number of people with formal employment, which is very important because it titles you to all kinds of labor rights that you don't have if you're working informally. Economic growth is surpassing market expectations again and again and again. And that has to do with, of course, trade with China. And I think it was really emblematic very early in this third term when I believe it was Ford plants in the Northeast. I want to say there was 2 or 3 of them that were shutting down and being taken over and converted by BYD, the Chinese electric company. I mean, talk about a shift in a really tangible shift in industrial production in Brazil away from the United States to China. And Lula is, welcoming with open arms the production of Chinese electric vehicles in Brazil, the same Chinese electric vehicles that the Biden administration, and I think Kamala Harris has said she would continue this, as slapping enormous tariffs on in the United States, right? So that's a potential source of tension there in the future as well. But it reflects Lula's argument that Brazil should not choose sides in this budding Cold War between China and the United States, but rather pursue Brazilian interests. Trading with the United States extensively. I think the United States is now it's the second largest trade partner, China being the first, in pursuit of Brazilian interests. He gave a very, I think memorable line early in this third term. Lula did. He went to Washington as one of his very first international trips, and then China as one of his shortly after that. And when he was in China, the perception in the media was, and I encourage folks to go back and look at the coverage of the Washington trip and the China trip. The perception was that in China, Lula was received with much greater fanfare. They were announcing bigger, joint collaborations than in the relatively more muted reception in Washington. And Lula was asked about this in Beijing, and he said, look, I am abroad to pursue the interests of my country. And he said, when I am in China, I don't want people asking me what I did in Washington, who I talked to. And when I'm in Washington, I don't want people questioning my conversations in China. I'm pursuing the sovereign interests of my country and all this. And again, as we were saying, it could well be that the door is closing on this kind of middle of the road, diplomacy, much like what happened in the Cold War, where it became untenable for Brazil to pursue a strategy of, neutrality on the world stage. We're not there yet, and I do give the Biden administration personally some credit for that, for not putting Brazil and the Lula government sort of up against the wall and say, sort of choose. They haven't really done that, at least not publicly. But it's not a given that's possible. I think Lula remains committed to asserting Brazil as a large country with a large internal market that produces a lot of things that the world wants, refusing to choose, completely choose sides. And another piece of evidence for that is the fact that Celso Amorim, just this week, Lula's main foreign policy advisor, reiterated Brazil's reluctance to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil is one of the major South American outliers, or holdouts, I should say, in joining the BRI, which is China's, of course, global infrastructure, the New Silk Road, as it's also sometimes referred to, an attempt by China to sort of link much of the world together through infrastructure projects and loans and all these things. Brazil has long resisted joining that. I think because, again, it wants the benefits of trade with China. It wants all that good stuff without potentially locking itself into restrictive contract terms and things like that critics say China slips into much of the BRI, stipulations and things like this that might hurt smaller countries. I think Lula would say Brazil. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I would just point out that Brazil has one of the most powerful set of infrastructure development corporations, like André Gutierrez, and the reviled yet still extremely important Odebrecht. That is that there is internal industrial, very powerful corporations within the infrastructure development history of Brazil that would be highly resistant to entrance of Chinese. It's one thing if this is, Ecuador, which doesn't really have a construction industry except perhaps in housing, or something like Bolivia, which doesn't really. Colombia is a little bit different, but elsewhere they don't have, and when you travel there, you really see that the infrastructure is either being built by Korea or by China. And there's these enclaves that go along with it as well.
That's exactly right.
So
and
I think that's an important element of why they're resisting integrating into the Silk Road, the New World Silk Road. But
Right.
back to you.
I don't think Brazil, the Lula government, thinks they need that. Exactly as you say, much smaller countries that don't have the, for example, the capital to invest in, subway systems, port upgrades, airport upgrades. China uh, comes with a lot of capital, a lot of technical, know-how, and that looks pretty attractive. The Lula government, for very different reasons than say the Bolsonaro government, but the Lula government, I think, argues that Brazil doesn't need that kind of assistance, doesn't need to lock itself into those kind of agreements. And to the point about these Brazilian infrastructure giants, many of them, absolutely decimated by years of Operation Car Wash, which was that I think many of our viewers probably are familiar with that. One of the largest, sort of corruption investigations that revealed all kinds of shenanigans by these corporations in Latin America, in Brazil especially. Many in the PT, and I think Lula himself, he talks about this. I think he really feels this very deeply. That part of what that investigation was designed to do was precisely to weaken these parts, these major Brazilian companies that were doing really big logistical projects, not only in Latin America, but in West Africa, with the deliberate attempt, some in the PT, others might dismiss this as sort of conspiracy-minded thinking, but many in the PT feel that in this new emergent era of what looks like bipolarity at the world stage between China and the United States, that Lava Jato was an attempt, in simple terms, to kind of keep Brazil in its place, to limit its ability to turn away both from China and the United States, and perhaps to force Brazil, sort of back into the U.S. orbit and away from China, sort of away from the Belt and Road. This is why I think Lula has, in this third term that I began by discussing, really rekindled part of the policy of his last time in office, which was robust, in a way, state development, state capitalism, using Brazil's national banks to, expand the port system, to expand all kinds of different areas, so that Brazil, in this new emerging world moment here that we're entering, need not lock itself into a subservient relationship that the Belt and Road Initiative often imposes, but also that the United States doesn't seem to be offering, in any case, either. As we've been saying again and again, and maybe this is one of our takeaways for our viewers, is that there's no guarantee that this approach to foreign policy will work. It could well be that the door shuts on this, and that Lula stumbles, and this hurts him domestically. And there are always these rumblings in the Brazilian press that Lula, some argue on the center right or conservative, that Lula is making a fool of himself, that he's out of his depth in a lot of these international high stake discussions. My own view is that so far it seems to be delivering in a lot of ways, getting a lot of good from a potentially tricky and tense political situation abroad. But of course, there's no guarantee that that will continue to be the case. That's why these next 2 years of Lula's term are so decisive, because I think it will tell us a lot about Brazil's foreign policy for the next decade in these next 2 years.
I thought maybe we go to one of the questions from the Q&A, because look at the questions we have there, shift the focus a little bit from sort of Brazilian geopolitical context to Brazil in domestic politics in Brazil. I think you can see the questions as well today. Ferguson asked, what role can the growing evangelical population play in Brazilian politics? And I would just add to that, certainly in the 2020 municipal elections, in previous municipal elections, right, there's been candidates like Crivella and Rio who are explicitly identified with evangelical churches, and were sort of seen as kind of the rival on the scene, but sort of at the sign of the growing influence and desire of the evangelical and churches to play a big influence in politics. I know it's a little bit early to know exactly how this played out since the runoff was just on Sunday, but what kind of growth or not growth did we see for evangelical candidates in the most recent? And you still aligned heavily with the right, or is there an evangelical centrão or an evangelical left even?
Yeah, I think here too, the picture is a little bit muddled. So, maybe as an example, the marquee race, the city of São Paulo, where you had I mentioned the sort of center-right candidate, you had a far-right sort of influencer, social media figure, Pablo Marçal. I think he's the guy getting hit by the chair in the flyer for the stock, against the left winger. That figure, Pablo Marçal, part of what I think made him catch so much attention was not only his influencer background and all this stuff, but also the way in which he tried to co-opt the language of evangelical pastors as it relates to politics. And this created a huge fight, among large mega pastors of the neo-Pentecostal faith, like Silas Malafaia, against Pablo Marçal, in part because I think he potentially represents a future in which evangelical churches and evangelical sort of decision makers, I think it's a term, who are helping the faithful, to make political decisions, usually in favor of far-right candidates. Pablo Marçal represents a potential unmediated relationship between voters and that kind of evangelical right-wing political action. The prosperity gospel was a big thing as well. Silas Malafaia, he almost came out and said it, that he doesn't want people like this usurping the power of the pulpit. So that is, as you say, it's early. It'll be interesting to watch, but it seems like there is room. The political entrepreneurs on the right are much more active, I would argue, in this evangelical space, which only continues to grow in Brazil in terms of prominence and political influence. That is where a lot of political innovation is happening, is in the relationship of evangelical voters to their representatives, much more so than anything I think we're seeing on the left. So the PT is still struggling to have to reach these people. There is I'm blanking on his name right now, but there is maybe Brian knows. He's a member of Congress, and he is trying to basically find a way to help the Lula government, the Lula administration, communicate better with evangelicals, who, of course, it's always worth pointing out, are not a monolith. There are various different denominations. Overall, they tend to support right-wing candidates. Jair Bolsonaro has become very adept at appealing to this growing group of the Brazilian population. As of now, I think there is still more or less kind of stasis when it comes to how evangelicals vote in municipal elections. It's not like, for example, anyone on the left suddenly found a way to appeal en masse to evangelical voters. That is something that the members of the PT, I almost think Lula, he has talked about trying to do this. I almost think it's like trying to teach him, a new way, a man who's almost 80, a new way of speaking, a new way of being in politics. Lula talks like a social democrat of the 20th century in a lot of ways, as a labor leader. That's a very different place than where Brazil is today, in a place in which evangelical churches are often the front line of the provision of social goods for people in a lot of need. PT has not found a way to talk with them yet, and I think it will require a greater act of reinvention to meet this new political moment than anything we've seen since the rise of the PT in the first place. That is to deal with the growing political prominence of evangelicals in Brazil.
Henrique Vieira, right? The one from the PSOL from
Yes. Thank you. Exactly.
And then another question we had from Steve Scheib was, there's a few different questions in there. We can touch on a couple of them. So, Kassab is kind of being the mover and shaker for the Centrão in this most recent election. What is he angling to do? Right? Is he setting himself up as a prospective presidential candidate for 2026? What is sort of his aim in sort of becoming the coordinator of the Centrão, I guess?
Yeah, I have been half jokingly with myself toying with the idea that Kassab is a committed public servant who sees, I'm kind of half serious here, I think, who sees the most politically useful role for himself and the PSD, his party, as a kind of fiador, as a kind of stabilizing force, as it were, of the Brazilian political system. By which I mean, what's in it for him? It's that ability to keep the Brazilian political system, Brazilian democracy, therefore, from keeling over from one side to the next. Now, obviously, this comes with enormous power for himself, but I suppose he's a somewhat guarded figure in his personal life. When he ran for mayor against the PT's Marta Suplicy, in the last, over 15 years ago now, there were insinuations about his sexuality. He's a very guarded person in his private life, who clearly is most comfortable operating sort of behind the scenes. So, in other words, what's in it for him? Clearly, there is a lot of political power, financial power that comes from being a party as big and sought after as the PSD. But I like to think it's not absurd to believe that it's actually probably a good thing, given the reality of the political situation, to have someone like Kassab, who is not a Bolsonarista, but is on the center right, while maintaining working relations, and by all accounts, relatively warm relations with Fernando Haddad and Lula himself. I think that's what he sort of hoped to be, is like someone who's at this very center of the political conversation, which he now very much is.
I think people like Kasabi have been long reviled by scientists, for example, as a sort of physiologismo, right? This non-ideological approach to politics. I think what you're sort of getting at is that in the context of Brazilian political culture as it's existed ever since really the proclamation of the Republic, if not before, the idea that a politician's job is to conciliate between different factions, is to never completely get in bed with your friends and never completely alienate your enemies. That is an ideology, right?
Right.
And it's also one that has become increasingly threatened, right, by the extreme polarization that has arisen in Brazilian politics between left and right, especially since the arrival of Bolsonaro at the scene. And so, I think
that's an excellent point. Yeah,
to me that we can envision a world in which Kasabi thinks that, like, no, actually, this sort of, the conciliação, right, the so-called conciliação in Brazilian politics, that even though that's, not entirely true, at least in his mind, that could be something worth preserving.
Right. It's somewhat perhaps equivalent in a U.S. political context when people wax nostalgic about the way the Senate used to work, that you didn't, you might not get along with someone, but you could at least talk to them and maybe have a drink or whatever it is after, yelling at them on the floor of the Senate. Kasabi might represent that instinct that, in this incredibly heated environment in which Bolsonaristas are on social media and they're making up all kinds of horrible things, that at the end of the day, and again, I resist the urge to romanticize this too much, because of course it's not anyone's ideal political system, perhaps, but given the stakes of governing in a country as large and diverse and complicated as Brazil, I don't, I think they can play a salutary role. It reminds me a little bit of Lula when he was campaigning in 22, yes, for president. Someone asked him about the role of corruption in Brazil, and that the PT under his watch oversaw corruption scandals and failed to end corruption in Brazil. And Lula gave what I thought was a very honest argument, which was that, look, we were elected, the PT, to implement a series of policies to improve living standards for working people, all these things. The challenge of eliminating corruption in Brazil is not one that any president under the existing rules can feasibly carry out. And so what I understood him to be saying was, in order to root out corruption, you would need to empower somebody with enormous arbitrary authority, which itself would lead to all kinds of corrupt outcomes. So he was saying, I was elected to govern within the existing political framework as it is, to deliver results for people who voted for me. And so in order to do that, people like Kassab, exactly as you noted, Brian, that's how it happens. People who have large numbers of members of Congress who are in their party, who they can negotiate with, And so it's almost Kassab plays an almost educational role for how things usually get done in Brazilian politics. That's changed with all kinds of loosening of amendment rules so that spending now flows in ways that it didn't used to. But I think Kassab is a kind of throwback political kingpin that now many Brazilians perhaps look back somewhat fondly, given the vitriol and the sort of no holds barred nature of governance, especially on the right.
I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. Susanna, did you want to jump back in with anything else, or?
Hold on. Well, we haven't really gotten to the environmental question and the COP, which is one of the questions that will be in this whole question of conciliation and the politics of Brazil. The dynamics of the Amazon remain kind of problematic for Lula.
Right.
Partly because he's got internationally, there's a lot of pressure about climate change. Many argue that the Belém COP will be the last COP, because if nothing happens, like welcome to the pyrocene, as I always like to say. So the question I have is that there's huge expectations. There's hope that there could be some kinds of financing and so on that would go forward. But as you note, there are not that many people who support the kind of environmental agenda that Lula discusses more broadly when in the international sphere. So this is one where there's kind of a big disjuncture between the international projection and the national politics.
No, it's important to be clear that the Lula government has not advanced as much as people would have liked when it comes to fighting deforestation, when it comes to protecting and elevating the role of indigenous people in when it comes to public policy, in a lot of ways. As I mentioned earlier, many of my relatives, almost all of them, voted for Bolsonaro, and so I have a cousin who's always sending me stories on Instagram about the rates of deforestation and how it's almost breaking records in certain areas. And he'll say things like, "I thought Lula was supposed to fix this. Oh, when Bolsonaro did it, it was a whole international story. Leonardo DiCaprio and everybody was weighing in on Brazil deforestation, all these things. What's happening now?" The difference, as I see it, is that nobody is under any illusion that Lula and his government are happy about this. Right? Under Bolsonaro, this was a matter of policy. This was the policy, facilitating deforestation, in part because a major pillar of Bolsonaro's support was, big ag and agricultural interests that want as much land as possible for all kinds of interests, cattle grazing, pasture, things like this. The Lula government is not beholden to those interests. Quite the contrary. It believes in certainly deforestation, that's a bad thing. I mean, I mentioned earlier these disputes within the administration. There's a reason why Marina Silva is still in the government as the Minister of the Environment. She is a major validator, I think, of the Lula government on the world stage. People know who she is. They respect her history as a woman who came from pretty deep poverty and was illiterate until I believe her 20s, and taught herself to read and write, and has she's a profound symbol of working class Brazilian empowerment in a different context than Lula, right? In a kind of Amazonian context. But that doesn't negate the fact that the government is driven by these different interests. Certainly, I think deforestation is one where the government is all on board with. It needs to do more, to rein this problem in. The issue is, as I tell this cousin of mine who's always sending me stories, is that the Bolsonaro administration, there is so much damage that's done when you have 4 years of essentially no enforcement when it comes to Brazil's existing environmental legislation, which is quite strong. But like, for example, I remember early on in the Lula government, they're finding secret landing strips in the Amazon to facilitate the flow of illicit, commerce out of the Amazon. These are hard to track. They're hard to find. They need to be destroyed. And they're all part of the economic machinery that fuels deforestation and all kinds of other environmental crimes. One that I think Lula is dragging his feet on weighing in on is the one I mentioned earlier about this decision on whether to drill in the Amazon for oil at the mouth of the Amazon River. I think part of the reason why we don't really have a firm sort of sense here is because Lula, I think himself, is not, is reluctant to weigh in one way or the other in the name of preserving that balance, preserving that heterogeneous governing coalition. So I could equally imagine a Lula government doubling down on fossil fuel extraction. I could also imagine a Lula government that embraces the most ambitious eco-socialist demands that Petrobras become a green energy, behemoth, not just oil. That maybe is less likely, but there are calls for that, and the leftmost part of Lula's coalition, that Petrobras, sort of what Petro promised in Colombia, which is to use Petrobras, one of the largest oil corporations in the world, as an engine for a green transition. Brazil has one of the greenest energy matrices in the world, but there are calls from within the coalition that it can and should do more to hasten that. That's by no means
I was just going to say, I was just going to say that the drought the energy system is largely linked to hydropower, and that's been radically affected by the droughts of the recent years, and that's reflecting deforestation. So it's kind of complicated. And Brazil is in the top 5, if not, among top 10, if not 5, among fossil fuel producers. So it's not nothing to say leave it in the ground. Maybe Petro can, but the eponymously named Petro of Colombia, but even he is under the gun because of the importance in their export portfolio.
And that is part of the dilemma that Lula, I think, faces and will face in the next 2 years, which is that, to kind of tie up some of the things we were saying, in these next 2 years, nobody in the PT or this sort of broad coalition of the center left that Lula is the head of, nobody's under any illusion that the government must deliver economic growth, must deliver material progress, or risk the return of the far right. And this is not a normal time where it's sort of center right. The stakes of a return of the radical right is really dire for Brazil. And so if that means, for example, that this is what Randolfo Rodrigues, the senator of Acre, argues, that drilling in that project would deliver, jobs and resources and do all kinds of wonderful things, one could see that tipping the scale in favor of drilling and all this stuff at the expense of the environment, because economic growth, that's what's key, that's the priority. So we don't really know which way that'll go. It's something for us all to keep our eyes on, though.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, because of course the international pressure will be enormous because of the COP meeting.
Exactly. Yeah.
And almost it sort of depends on the ability, instead of to deliver some kind of conservation funding, which so far no one has really been able to do in any substantive thing. And the offsetting things have been turned out to be so corrupt that, it's kind of discredited one of the major models. So.
Yeah, and it strikes me as one of those things too, as the 2026 campaign approaches in 2 years, a presidential campaign. I don't think Lula will be able to run on a particularly robust environmental record, but he certainly will be able to say that the alternative will be worse. The alternative, will have no commitments, to any kind of environmental safeguards. Again, is that enough? In a heated presidential race to say that we're not as bad as the alternative would be when it comes to the environment, or does Lula in these next 2 years, give increased weight to the environmental question? I'll give you a hint of another an example of how this matters in tangible terms. Lula has been trying since he came to power to sew together a trade deal between Mercosur and the European Union. And he has talked about this Macron has talked about this as a centrally important geopolitical arrangement in this era of polarization. Lula said, in an interview, increasingly it's going to be the United States and it's going to be China. That if South America and Western Europe want to have their own sort of independent room to maneuver and trade, there must be a concrete deal in the books that links the European Union to Mercosur, which is a bloc of countries in South America. That has not yet happened. And the Brazilians argue that the main sticking point are European demands regarding environmental standards.
Yeah.
Environmental standards that Lula this is one way in which, weirdly, there is some degree of overlap between Bolsonaro and Lula, which is that the argument that those environmental demands are either untenable, unrealistic, or self-serving for Europeans. And so that'll be something to watch in these next 2 years too, is whether that gets off the ground, and whether they're able to get over these sticking points and sign a deal, those sticking points being primarily environmental for a Mercosur under Brazil's leadership, signing a trade deal with the European Union, to say nothing of sort of nettlesome neighbors in South America, right? Like what Milei in Argentina will do, how that will affect Brazil, Chile, when Chileans go to the polls, how all these things will affect Brazil's standing in the hemisphere. So it's a very complicated picture.
Yeah, it's a very complicated picture too, by the fact that there's really serious environmental consequences coming now in the drying up of large tributaries of the Amazon, like the Madeira, the impact on hydropower, the Paraná.
The pictures are horrifying. Yeah.
And then with the stable instability within the larger climate system, the whole story about Porto Alegre, which was completely unprepared. So there are billions of reais and a larger climate thing in which Amazonia, I understand the questions that are coming up, but Amazonia is this big carbon engine. And if you start to destabilize that, there are it doesn't just sit still. It's an actin, and it starts to structure what are the conditions of possibility. So it's a very interesting thing. And of course, there's lots of resistance in Europe as a consequence of the they don't want to have Brazilian beef come in. They don't want to have Brazilian wheat come in because it undercuts their own producers, which are EU producers. So it's a both an environmental and a major trade question.
Right, and it's why, just to go back to the very beginning, I think for Lula to project himself as a leader of Mercosur, of Brazil, it matters what his political standing is at home, because if he's a lame duck going into 2026, that will affect, I think, considerations, in these last 2 years. And he's certainly not that. He's certainly not a lame duck. He's very much politically alive and delivering in certain areas. The question that's before us will be to see if he can harness political good news in economic terms and other areas for these broader, perhaps more ambitious geopolitical goals that have so far eluded him in this third term.
Yeah. Well, listen, Andre, this has been so stimulating. Thank you for taking all this time. Brian, do we have any other questions coming up here?
Some questions in the Q&A, which I think we can probably touch on quickly because they're kind of about the same thing. The first was from Gilberto Ribeiro dos Santos. Kind of takes exception with the idea that Bolsonaro is extreme right and says he's just against the system. That Lula, on the other hand, is the one who is an extremist. The other question from Daryl Ferguson, which is kind of related to this, I think, but it's something we could probably that maybe you can address, says that this using the term radical right to refer to Bolsonaro, maybe it's not necessarily he thinks the term radical is kind of creating a straw man, right? And that you have to consider that just because Bolsonaro is on the right doesn't mean that his ideas for economic development are necessarily wrong, and asked if you are endorsing a left-wing model for Brazilian development, I've read enough of what you've written in the press to I think your perspective on Brazilian development is probably more to the left and to the right. But did you want to address that briefly?
Yeah, for some reason, I see the Q&A here, but all I see is what Brian has. I don't see.
Maybe you can't see it.
But here we go. I'm sorry. I just got it. No, okay. So regarding the question of radical, I suppose. No, I mean it's helpful to think about why radical right. I suppose I say radical in the sense of given Brazil's political system as it has existed, as it has developed since the return of democracy, Bolsonarismo represents the most concerted and vociferous, whatever adjective one wants to use, against the system as it has developed. And Lula, I think, cannot be considered a radical because he is a mainstay of that system, has prevailed, has won and lost in that system, and never called it into question, as Bolsonaro has. Refusing to accept orders from the Supreme Court, for example, directing his supporters to disregard the results of elections. So when I say radical, I suppose it's in that sense of representing the most concerted and dedicated and vociferous challenge to the ideals of the new republic as it was created and constituted after the return of democracy. It's not necessarily a pejorative. I mean, sometimes radicalism is needed. Sometimes radicalism is good. My own view is that the kind of radicalism that Bolsonaro, I would argue, represents is not a good thing. It's not a healthy one. And so I suppose I would say that I do consider myself a person on the left, progressive, all these things. And I find that, for example, even when I'm teaching and in my writing, I try to be upfront about that because we all have our views on things. We all have our biases and what we think works, and judging from history, what we have to think is the best outcome for the most number of people. And so I'm not an economist. I suppose I wouldn't endorse one economic model over another. What I think is important is that politics as it exists. We talked about municipal elections. We talked about the federal level here. That it empower ordinary people to improve their own lives and the lives of their communities, and the people in them, particularly with attention paid to minorities of all kinds of different meanings of what that word means. And my own view is that Bolsonaro does not represent that. I think that he represents an exclusionary political project that I don't think has the recipe to deliver the most good for the most people. I suppose that's one way, a utilitarian way of thinking about it. Now, I hope what's come across in our conversation here too is that it's not as if Lula and the PT are doing all good all the time. There are really challenging questions that the party, it does not seem to be at the present moment showing itself to be up to dealing with, to be up to answering. This is why, I mentioned at the beginning, many in the party are turning against each other. We saw, for example, after Sunday's race, a spat between Gleisi Hoffmann, the head of the PT, and Alexandre Padilha, both of the PT, Padilha being in charge of the Lula's articulation with Congress and other institutions, government institutions, about the party itself. So there is fighting, there is uncertainty on the left too. I don't want to suggest that the left has all the answers, Lula is infallible. Quite the contrary. What we're seeing is a really delicate moment in which progressive forces are dealing with a rising tide of conservative reaction at home and abroad. And the reason I center Lula so much in this debate, not only because he's president, of course, but because his entire political project, from the moment he emerges on the national scene in the late 1970s, is one that, at least rhetorically, whatever one thinks of Lula, at least rhetorically, is about empowering people who have not had a direct influence over the political system as it has existed. And I would argue, and I argue this in my forthcoming book, that Lula that's been the sort of North Star of his political project domestically, but also internationally. That's part of why he insists that Brazil needs and deserves a role on the UN Security Council, I argue it's as an extension of his view that it's empowering working people, empowering the excluded, can yield really positive dividends for everybody. We don't all have to agree on that. Not everybody does, of course, but it's where I think I tend to fall on the question.